Have you ever found yourself wondering, is the person I'm with actually a narcissist? Or maybe you felt stuck in a painful relationship cycle that you just can't seem to make sense of. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, you're going to hear a clip from an interview I did with Valerie Green on her podcast, Soul Shaking Love. We dive into two of the most common and important questions people raise when it comes to narcissistic relationships. 1. How do you know if the person you're with is on the narcissistic spectrum? And 2, what are the typical painful cycles people get caught in when they're in these types of relationships? We talk about the different forms narcissism can take, like grandiose versus vulnerable narcissist, the fantasy that often binds people to these relationships, and how all of it traces back to early emotional wounds. If you find this clip interesting and you want to hear more, stay tuned. Next week, I'll be releasing another segment. But if you like to hear the entire interview now, you can head over to her podcast. I'll include the link in the show notes below. As always, if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. Okay, let's get right into it.
And so today, I'm really excited to be interviewing Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Valerie.
It's just we were really passionate about this topic because basically Anthony is a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist who specializes in psychodynamic treatment for individuals and couples, specializing in personality disorders, including narcissism and borderline personality, among others. And so I thought it would be amazing if we can talk about just narcissism in general and whether a narcissist is capable of changing. How do you know if you're with one or even if you might be on the spectrum yourself? And what are the steps of changing? What's even possible to be more empathic, to be more present, to have a healthy relationship? Because most of the advice that is given around narcissism is if you discover that you're with a narcissist to leave.
Yes.
That might be good advice, right? I mean, we can even start there, right? But like the purpose of the interview is like, that might be the advice, the good advice, but then what are the steps in discovering whether you can make it work before you leave? And then it's really difficult to leave. So if we do get to that, there's basically two parts to this interview. And if we get to both, great. If not, then people can tell us if they want us to get to the second part, which is, why is it so hard to leave? And how do you leave? And how do you heal after you leave? Because those are really important topics too. But today, we're planning on focusing on what is narcissism and what change is possible.
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say thank you very much, Valerie, for having me here and giving me this opportunity to share just some of my thoughts on what's a really complicated topic, right? A diagnosis. So there's a lot here. And I think a good place to start is maybe just descriptively, like, how do I know if the person that I'm with, whether it's a partner, a parent, a sibling, a colleague, how do I know if I'm with somebody who has these narcissistic characteristics? And I like to describe it that way because I think, as you mentioned, it's on a spectrum. So it can range all the way from people who have some of these narcissistic traits all the way up to somebody who's formally diagnosed with like NPD, which is a personality disorder. But one of the main defining characteristics in my field is what we call the grandiose sense of self. And that's just basically when someone has a belief, like a firm conviction of their own superiority. Like they really believe that they are above everybody else, that they're special, that they deserve special treatment. These are the people who feel like they shouldn't have to wait online, for instance, because only fools wait online. And why would they do that? So they tend, when there's this grandiose structure, they tend to over exaggerate their accomplishments, and they have intense fantasies about success, things that they could achieve. But we all have fantasies of success, but that are way beyond their capabilities. Like these are fantasies that are not reasonable. Now, paradoxically, this also goes along with the grandiose sense of self. So again, if you're with somebody or you recognize this, it's one of those maybe descriptive qualifiers, which is they also have bouts of insecurity and inferiority, which seems really strange because on the one hand, they seem so superior and above everybody. But then on the other hand, when there's some sort of crack in that armor, right, they have these bouts of insecurity and they need to get rid of those as quickly as possible because they're so objectionable. So you see them oscillating, then they go back up to then the grandiose position, which may just mean, by the way, being critical of you or putting you down in some way.
Right.
And this speaks to the other criteria, which is, as you could imagine, if they have this deep insecurity, they also have very precarious self-esteem. And that's a whole nother way to define narcissism, is that the whole grandiose sense of self is a defense against this deep feeling of inferiority. So they have the grandiose sense of self, they have these bouts of insecurity, they have fragile self-esteem, and it's so fragile that even if you offer, I don't even want to say a criticism because it doesn't even have to be a criticism. It could be any kind of feedback on something that maybe needs improvement. But what you'll quickly find is an intense level of defensiveness. They'll go into long explanations in terms of why they did something the way that they did, or they'll attack you. So as you can imagine, all this leads to the final thing that I want to mention in terms if you're just trying to identify this, is they have problems with intimacy. Many of these people could be successful at work. Some of them are even CEOs or leaders in major nations, right? But they all have problems with intimacy. And they have problems because, in part, relationships are one-sided. In other words, they're always looking for the recognition, the admiration, the attention, or to be taken care of in some way, depending on the type of narcissism. But all of this leads to then interpersonal struggles, which cuts across different areas of their life when they try to get close to anybody, if they can get close. So maybe let me just pause there for a moment and see if any of this is resonating. Does this sound familiar to you, Valerie? Or
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've studied a lot about narcissism myself just because it's part of my job as a relationship coach to help people to tell in the beginning if they have these red flags. And that's why I know it is a spectrum and there's 13 characteristics that define it. I completely agree. You listed the major ones.
And what happens, just so you mentioned, like the spectrum, that part is really important because the stronger the grandiose sense of self, typically the higher functioning person this is. So even somebody with narcissism can function at a pretty high level because that grandiosity holds them in place. But for those who are on the lower end of the spectrum, what happens is the grandiosity is weaker, so they're more fragile, in other words. And these are the people that you see oscillating more. And just to follow this through, these are the people who get a little bit closer to what we call borderline personality disorder, where you see more of that splitting and emotional dysregulation. It's not to say that people with narcissism don't become emotionally dysregulated, but the firmer the grandiose sense of self is just less likely because you could say something that's upsetting to them. And if that grandiose structure is in place, they just dismiss it. Like you don't mean anything to them anyway. Your opinion or your feedback is irrelevant because you're stupid or.
Right.
So,
Although you can feel the contempt, even if they're ignoring you,
Oh,
and
yes.
that is abuse, but you can feel the contempt.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then that wall goes up, which we call like the impenetrable stone wall. And then they kind of cut you off at that point. So it's kind of an abandonment as well, which is really difficult, to be in a relationship with somebody like that who can easily just cut you off emotionally, that is.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I mean, one of the key factors, as I understand, is because of that. And I think, what I've heard, I actually really love the book. I forgot the author, but it's called The Wizard of Oz and Other Narcissists.
Mm.
You're familiar with that one?
I had an interview recently and somebody mentioned this. So I haven't read it, but I heard of it. Yeah. But
Mhm.
what would you think? What part of the book was resonating with you?
Yeah, so they make a distinction between an overt narcissist and a covert narcissist, which I think is what you're talking about. Overt narcissists own the grandiosity. So
Yes.
they need validation that they're the best. And if they get validation that they're the best, then they're generous and helpful. But even if you try to help, if you give them advice, they'll think you're telling them they're stupid and
Yes.
they'll rail against you or dismiss you or you'll get the contempt. So that's the overt. The covert, as that book describes it, is where they actually do have low self-esteem and they have a victim story. Everyone's always out to get me. But the grandiosity is for a cause. Like they become activists or they work
Mm.
for nonprofits because they're like, I used to be an animal rights activist in college, and I knew a lot of people like this where they're like, people suck. Animals deserve to be,
Mm.
fought for. I don't care about people. I'm going to be
Yeah.
mean to people. Animals deserve to be, because it's caused by developmental wounding at a very young age, where people weren't safe to be around and animals were for them.
That's right. Yeah.
And so
And an
it's
animal can give
very,
you what? They say this about animals, but they give you unconditional love, right? Where a human can really get upset with you when you do something to them. Yeah, that's like a whole nother presentation of narcissism. But just to give a sense, now you made me think of something else. So on the one hand, just if we go to the extremes, you have the grandiose narcissist. That's like your prototypical narcissist that people think of. And all the way on the other extreme, you have something called the vulnerable narcissist. And it's
mhm.
not like somebody is one or the other. I like to use this example of Tony Soprano. I don't know if you watched The Sopranos many years ago, but this was a guy who fell more in the category of the grandiose narcissist, maybe even malignant, which is a whole nother category. But then there was a point in the show when he left. His wife kicked him out, basically. And there was a separation, which is a big deal with narcissists because they do not tolerate separation very well. And he was living at his mother's house, right? She wasn't there. But suddenly, what you saw is he's on the phone late at night with other members of the mafia, and he can't get off. Like he wants to just keep talking, and it's late, and they're tired, and you could see they want to get off the phone, but he needs them there, right? And that's more the vulnerable presentation. So if you're
Mhm.
thinking about whether you yourself struggle with these characteristics or you're in a relationship with somebody, that stuff is important to pay attention to as well, which is the whole vulnerable presentation. These are the people who present just the opposite of the grandiose. Instead of overtly outgoing, they're overtly insecure, helpless, needy. These are the kind of people who are always complaining about something, and they have this attitude that they need to be taken care of, that they can't do it on their own. So that's a whole nother segment of
Right.
narcissism, but nevertheless, still narcissism because why? They still get that attention, they still get that caring, which is what they need to bolster their sense of self, right? Which is fragmented. So, what holds them together is not the grandiose structure. What actually holds them together is the feeling that somebody's there taking care of them and that they really love them.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll talk more about vulnerability versus swapping interviews. So I'm talking
Mhm.
about healing codependence. And
Mm,
so what
yes.
I'm hearing about what you're saying is that the kind of vulnerability of a vulnerable narcissist, which I think is similar to a covert narcissist, is a victim story. I
Hmm.
was hurt, so I deserve to be taken care of. And there is an empowered vulnerability of healthy interdependence.
Hmm.
I'm sad, but I'm solution focused. I'm sad. I'm looking for somebody to help me figure out what
Yeah.
I need so I can move forward. So I just want to we can put a bookmark there because we'll talk about
Yes, I'm excited to hear about this. Absolutely.
and of course you can talk more about it too because I'm picking your brain.
Well,
But
because codependency, to your point, it's such a big part of narcissism. And when we go a little bit further, as you and I are chatting, at some point we have to talk about relationships, right? And how people get caught in these relationships. You mentioned it a moment ago, right? But there's the codependency right there. That's a big part of how they end up getting caught up in these relationships and why they can't get out.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that with the codependent part. But what I wanted to say is I'm validating that the kind of vulnerability that a narcissist will have will be a victim story.
Well, yes. Can I just add one thing to that though? So with the covert narcissist, the one that you mentioned earlier, that's the presentation that they're the victim and that you've done something to them,
Right.
right? That somehow you've wronged them. With the vulnerable narcissist, you don't hear the victim as much, but you hear the needy cry to be taken care of. So
Mhm.
depending on the cluster, if we could say that, because remember, they're not mutually exclusive. There's some of these characteristics and traits in all different types of narcissism, but predominantly what you're talking about, the victimhood, that's at the essence, like sort of the core of the covert narcissist, that they're always wronged. And you need to apologize and you end up feeling guilty when you're around them, like you did something so devastating that you've harmed them in some way. But
Mhm.
it's so subtle, and that's the part of the manipulation, and it's so hard to detect as well.
No, exactly. And I think it's important to recognize that that same humbleness is not coming back towards you,
Hmm. Yeah.
which is hard to see if we're codependent. But I'm laughing, but I mean, I am actually still healing the vestiges of my own codependence, which I'll talk about in my interview.
Oh, okay.
So I'm laughing because I get amused at my own limitations as well, but it's not a
Mm,
funny dynamic, it's a serious dynamic.
yes.
There's one more thing that I wanted to ask you about
Hmm.
in terms of defining narcissism. And then, of course, I want to go into like what are the painful cycles that we get caught in when we're with
Okay.
a narcissist. But the thing I really want to focus on is why is it incapable for them to have empathy? Because I think that's one of the main, and they can fake empathy. But in order to have real empathy, you need to recognize that the other person has different feelings and different needs than you.
That's
And
right.
is
That's
their
it. That's it. You said it.
personality
No,
right?
Valerie, you just said it right there. That's the essence of it right there. Because there is this lack of what we call self-other differentiation, relationships tend to be merged. There's the codependency. So to have true empathy, you have to be able to step into somebody else's experience. In other words, you have to be curious about what their experience was like. But to do that implies what? That they're a separate person, right? With their own life, with their own thoughts and feelings different than yours. And that's threatening. That's very threatening. And I'll go into that more when we talk about the cycles. But
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to have empathy, because they have these shallow relationships with people that never allow the person to be separate from them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's the main dynamic that causes all the painful cycles. So yeah, that's why I wanted to bring that up. But of course, now we can talk about what are the painful cycles that people get caught in relationships with a narcissist, and so that we might be able to identify those and see
Yes.
if indeed that's where we're at or if that's where someone we know is at.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to answer, I want to just be transparent with you and your audience. So my response to this question is going to be from a psychodynamic perspective. Okay.
Mhm.
So to answer this question, when we think about these painful cycles, I think we need to consider, where do relationships, when you're in a narcissistic relationship, if you're in a relationship with somebody who you think may have these characteristics, where does that relationship primarily exist? Primarily, it exists in fantasy. And what that means is that there's always this fantasy, that there's this hope, right? That things will be different in the future. So at its core, the fantasy is about, remember I mentioned the grandiose sense of self a little bit earlier, but that sense of self is kind of meaningless unless it's merged with, this is what we were just talking about, an idealized other. And that's what makes a blissful union right there.
Mhm.
So the grandiose sense of self is I have a need, like not to wait in line, for example. And the idealized other is the person who's supposed to be there immediately to gratify that need. So there's your blissful union and your lack of separation and individuation in this relationship. But this exists primarily in fantasy, as you can imagine, because nobody is always present to meet your need. And that's when things begin to crack a little bit. It's about this the main goal with the in the relationship is the blissful, undisturbed, symbiotic union, right? Because we know that there's been childhood trauma, and this is the stuff that went missing very early in life. Either it was ruptured prematurely, or too quickly, or too consistently. So they never had that feeling of somebody really being there for them to contain them. The empathy that you mentioned earlier, what we call affective resonance, to really understand them. So part of what goes on in these relationships is they're always looking for somebody or expecting somebody is going or hoping that somebody's finally going to recognize them in a way that they've never been recognized before. So that's just sort of the foundation, unfortunately, sadly, of these relationships. And it's so compelling. I have to tell you that even when you may notice it, or you have friends or family members maybe who say to you that this relationship is very toxic or you need to leave, back to your point where you started way at the very beginning. Remember, the number one advice is you need to leave these relationships.
Right.
It's not that simple. That's like such superficial advice. That's advice for someone who doesn't really appreciate how compelling this fantasy is and how it sustains them and the hope sustains them. It's like asking someone to give up their left arm. It really is, because that's the merged experience. So
Mhm.
that's the foundation of the relationship, and
Right.
in part why it's difficult. Yeah, go ahead. Please jump in, please.
Oh, no, I mean, I'm just validating you, but it is when we're in a relationship with somebody where we have, and I feel compassion for people that are on the NPD spectrum because they're literally not aware that they're idealizing the other person and
Mhm.
expecting them. It's all these
That's
unconscious
right.
expectations. They feel like that they're out of control with it when someone points that out because it occurs to them as obvious, like I deserve this and the other person should be giving it to me. It's like a given. And it's
Mhm.
the thing is, like, if they don't get it, they fly into this rage because it challenges the mask that they had to build up to hide the shame when they were little.
Yes.
And
Yep.
they can't help it, is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, and this is such a good point you're raising, and I'm glad you said it. It's unconscious. It's not intentional. And unfortunately, like not unfortunately, but what's emerging in the literature, it's called the shared unconscious fantasy. So it's a shared fantasy between two people who come together. And that's where it gets very complicated, Valerie, because if you listen to social media, more often than not, it's always the narcissistic husband or narcissistic wife's fault,
Right.
and they want to blame somebody. And that's really easy and comfortable and reassuring to think that this didn't have anything to do with me. This was about how poorly they treated me. But it's called a shared unconscious fantasy because it's two people who come together who both have this fantasy that the other person is going to fulfill them. And by the way, that's where you come in because, and we'll get into this, I know, in the second in the next interview, but that's the codependency, right?
Exactly.
Because I'm sure there are many different ways to define it, but in part, what's codependency? It's when somebody's self-worth is dependent upon external what? Validation or recognition of you. And that's what makes it so hard to leave these relationships because if that's what's holding you together now, just waiting and hoping, and you do get this along the way, right? Because they have these moments of blissful togetherness when things are great, you know. That's why you always have to be careful when you're talking to somebody like this and they say, "We had an amazing weekend, things were great." You have to be suspicious of that. Like, why amazing? Like, why not a good weekend? But anyway, that goes back to the splitting, which, is another story. But
Yes.
yeah, the codependency, the enmeshment, all of this is what goes on in these relationships and makes it incredibly difficult to leave.
Mhm. No, exactly. I'm glad that you're saying that because it still might be the best thing to do to leave, but it's a question of how. And so let's continue, really just bottom lining what are these painful cycles? Because, like, it may be a case study or an example so that people can identify themselves. And then we can talk about how have you helped narcissists to recognize.
Okay. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.